afternoon, everybody. I'm going to do my best to beat what we've got in the background today, but I think I'm pretty loud, so hopefully you can hear me. My name is Zahira Marti. I am very proud to be your facilitator, moderator, host for this afternoon's panel. And today we're talking about collaborating towards the attainment of South Africa's Just Energy Transition Plan. I have some fantastic panelists up today, and essentially what we're doing is just talking about how private sector are supporting our energy goals for 2020. On the panel today, I have Ms. Shamila Subramani, the CEO of the National Business Initiative. I have Ms. Sue Lund, Program Manager for the President's Just Energy Transition Project Management Unit. I have Mr. Kulekane Marti, Deputy CEO of Business Unity South Africa, and Mr. Pavilion, Acting CEO for Brand South Africa. Now, in terms of what we aim to achieve from our panel today, it's very much about understanding our private sector and the role they're playing towards our energy goals and the Just Energy Transition Plan for 2030. I'm going to start by opening it up to our panelists, and perhaps we can start with Ms. Shamila to talk us through the NBI in terms of what you've achieved so far, and then later on we'll move on to what you have coming up.
Thank you. I don't know if I can compete, but I'll try. Okay, what next do? So good afternoon, everybody, and thank you. We're going into the late afternoon shift, so appreciate your time and endurance being here with us. I'm going to start off, I think, Zahira, by saying that we know over the last few days' conversation, it is critical that South Africa must find a path that addresses both mitigation and adaptation to climate change, and at the same time ensure that that we go through a socio-economically just transition. And I don't want to belabor the point about just, because we've had quite a few panels on that over the last few days, but those are things at the outset that we know we need to achieve. Now, within that, I think perhaps to set the context a little bit, as NBI, we're really very much quite an action-orientated arm, working with our coalition, a voluntary coalition of businesses that are working together to collaborate on systemic change. And there's a few things loaded in there. I mean, firstly, it's collaborative, which means we sort of have to try and work together on it. As cliched as that sounds, it needs to happen that way. And then systemic change means that the actions we take are going to have to try to transform at a systems level. And so in relation to climate change in particular, I think our key piece of work really over the last 3 years has been an effort, supported by Business Unity South Africa, and that we crafted with BCG to look at, firstly, is net zero by 2050 possible for our country, not just a global agreement, and what will that look like? And that was a piece of work that was done by over 450 different stakeholders across business society, business civil society, government, and that was also championed by a group of 30 CEO champions. So quite an enormous piece of work that was done. The outcome of the work, in very briefly, suggested that, yes, net zero by 2050 is possible in our context. And remember, the modeling also used the Eskom Plexus model, so it was really about our local context and how that could work. So not only is it possible, that if done correctly with following the recommendations that the report sets out, it could also be net jobs positive. And so there, I think, is some very useful building blocks for what we can look at in relation to the transition, and dealing with the concerns around job losses, but saying overall to the economy, we could also be net jobs positive. Of course, the nuances are very great depending on where you are, what that looks like, what the enabling environment needs to look like. So that piece of work was done there, but also some of the outcomes effectively said that South Africa can't sit idle and that we need to act now. We have a uniquely difficult starting point, and those are realities we do. We've got the triple challenge of inequality, unemployment, poverty, and a weak economy. One of the most carbon-intense economies in the world, facing increasing trade risks, as we've seen, and also one of the countries most at physical risk of the local impacts of climate change. And so we put all of this together, it is not an easy starting point for us. Secondly, more of the same is not going to be enough. I think we've seen up to now the real challenges we have in our economy, and so the need to transition is there. It's a clear imperative that needs to happen. We've got to become low carbon, more resilient and competitive economy. We are an open economy. we're not the size of a China or an India. We are very much an open economy and different dynamics at play, also different sets of trading partners to whom we sometimes feel like we're disproportionately exposed to in relation of what's happening there, and those are important points to note. Fourthly and thirdly, the net zero transition to support the net zero transition supports solving South Africa's pressing challenges. So it's a lot of weight to put on that climate bridge, as I've said before, but unfortunately this is where we are now and we do need to start. And the later we start, the more costly it becomes and the more unpredictable the costs become. And I think those are important. And the cost of inaction, like I've said, is massive. A carbon-intensive economy will face mounting trade risks, we know that. So from a business perspective, this is important for us. We could lose a significant portion of our export value. And so it's a double whammy on our economy. And inaction might miss the opportunity to capture, really starting off thriving new green industries that could really be our ticket to the future in changing that and maintaining our competitiveness. So as the NBI, we're really trying to work together to say, how do we make this tangible and real and work on the ground to enable that to happen? And it's both a top-down and a bottom-up, because we need to know that what is it that businesses are experiencing, and therefore how can that translate into what's possible at a country level to do. And also from the top down is to say we have key pieces of things like our Just Energy Transition Investment Plan, and so how can we translate that into meaningful change that business can lead with and use that as a catalyst to really springboard us into the green industrialization and realize this dividend that we know we have, and address those challenges. So let me leave it at that for now, but that's really where we try to effect change. Thank you.
Mr. Kulakani, if I can send a similar sort of question to you from a BUSA perspective. How have we come together? How are you collaborating within the unit? And then we'll move on to what we can look forward to.
Well, thank you very much, and good afternoon, everybody. To avoid covering the same ground that Shamla has already covered, firstly, I want to say two things. The first one is that, of course, the NBI and the work that the NBI is doing is practical demonstration of, one, the private sector's commitment to a partnership approach, but also to really playing a leadership role in the stewardship that is necessary to help us navigate what is treacherous waters ahead of us. And everything that he has said is really demonstrates that CEOs are committed to this, putting money to do research that points to specific things and actions that need to be undertaken. She mentioned something about our rather uniquely difficult starting point, and that is something I want to comment on, because as it is, we're not just facing a problem of the future. We're facing a problem today where, we do not have energy security in South Africa, which translates into a very weak economy, jobs being lost in various sectors of the economy. And so all of the stuff that we committed to in terms of just transition and so on is not only at risk, but we actually come from a deficit on all of these metrics. And so we have to, on the one hand, work at addressing these issues, and then look at how, in addressing the present challenges, we do not take our eyes off the ball in terms of the commitments that we've made towards a net zero by 2050. Just in the area of energy, as you know, or some of you may know, that the private sector is partnering with government to really try and address the present challenge in the energy space. We have an initiative that looks at 3 different issues, currently one being energy, and the second one being transport and logistics, and the third one being addressing crime and corruption. The partnership that we have with government is to try and make sure that we make a dent on these issues. Because if we don't, they really are a threat to everything that we're trying to do. The transport and logistics issues not only is it creating one of the biggest bottlenecks in our economy, all of the stuff that we read about queues of 40, 50 kilometers on the Lebombo border post, queues of a similar length at Richards Bay, etc. I mean, everywhere you look, you can just see how much, on the one hand, we're working against the very objectives of decarbonizing the economy, we're putting more and more trucks on the road, etc., etc. So we are facing this present challenge, and that's why we've decided to work with government on each of these to try and address them and to try and make sure that we arrest the situation as it is. We, as a private sector, are putting money and skills. The initiative is supported by more than 130 CEOs who've signed a pledge to work with government, because if we do not do that as the private sector, we think that we hate to think what the future looks like. So let me leave it at that. Thank you.
Thanks very much. Sue, I'm going to send the next one your way. We've heard from the private sector in terms of their ambitions, their goals, the efforts that they've already made with their various stakeholders. From a government perspective, what is it that you'd like to see? What is it that you're seeing? What is it that you feel you're not seeing from that sector in terms of collaboration at the moment?
Speak to the mic. Thank you very much. Lovely to be with you this afternoon on a Friday afternoon, and great to be with an esteemed panel. I'm from the JET PMU in the presidency, so I guess I do speak on behalf of government. First, let me just say that we're very excited about the JET implementation plan. This last week at COP has been so encouraging, because when we launched the JET implementation plan with the Minister of Forestry, Fisheries and Environment, we had the private sector on the panel, we had civil society on the panel, we had labor on the panel, and every one of our partners stood up and said, we're in this together, we've got to make it work. And in engagements with the philanthropies here at COP, with the International Partners Group that has committed finance to the just energy transition, and really with a whole range of stakeholders that are present here and representing many parts of our society, it's really been an all hands on deck kind of response. It's, we've got to get this right. And so in a way, I think South Africa can stand proud and say we are trailblazing the just energy transition. And I think we can say that confidently. Many countries are looking to us, and of course that puts a lot of pressure on us to get it right. But the approach we've taken to implementation of the just energy transition is a collaborative one. It is a co-creation one. It is saying that every part of our society has got a different element of value to bring to finding these solutions. So in the investment plan that we prepared last year and in the implementation plan that we prepared this year, the role of the private sector is absolutely key. I mean, of the 1.5 trillion rand price ticket that we put on a 5-year investment requirement for the just energy transition, that spans everything from big infrastructure to community development and economic diversification activities in the areas that are most affected by the transition. And in every one of those areas, there's a key role for the private sector. We actually earmarked in the region of 500 billion rand that we felt was entirely fundable by the private sector in that bundle of finance. And in fact, now we believe it's more. And that's because renewable energy is a very large portion of the ticket price. And already we've seen, just with some key regulatory changes, how we have unlocked the ability of the private sector to come to the party. And it's been tremendous. I mean, the uptake in renewable energy investment has really been phenomenal over the last year and a half. And we've got a huge pipeline of renewables coming on stream. The blockage now is that we don't have transmission grid capacity to take up that renewable energy investment. So from a presidency point of view, it's a key focus for us now. How do we unlock that transmission investment? And I suppose because there's always been a notion that the transmission grid is owned by Eskom, state-owned company, it's going to be Eskom that invests. And in fact, we know that Eskom's debt capacity is not only under moratorium at the moment, but in fact, even after the 3-year moratorium, it will be extremely limited. So we've come up with models for the involvement of the private sector in transmission grid investment. These models are well established globally, and I think there's increasing acceptance within government that in fact this is the way to go. So we're going to be prioritizing how we unlock the regulatory and procurement mechanisms to enable private investment in transmission as well as in renewable energy generation. So I think on the infrastructure side, there's a massive role to play. Then on the community level work and the economic diversification work and the skills development that is needed for the just transition, again, I think if you look at the work that NBI has been doing with all of the business community, there's huge scope on the skills side and a lot that is being developed already. And that's going to be a big priority going forward. You know, what skills do we need to develop from childhood level right through to tertiary in order to plan for the future, and we've got to get ahead of that game. And I think business is going to play a key role. There's a lot of money that goes into skills development in the private sector, and I think it's going to be a matter of all of us rallying together saying, how do we direct those resources in a way that really targets the right interventions at the right time? And then, you know, when we were looking at the grants packages for the just energy transition, we've got about in the region of $700 million committed in grants from the international community. But what we do know is that corporate social investment and ESD investment by the private sector actually constitutes about 45 billion rand a year in total. And of course, that doesn't all go to the just energy transition, but that's a big chunk of investable finance that we could certainly look at channeling more creatively in the just energy transition space. So we think we've got a lot of work ahead of us next year on that score. And to that end, we are setting up a just energy transition finance or funding platform, which we are looking to match grant capital that is available for the just transition with project originators who really want to develop entrepreneurial activities and new economic diversification opportunities, particularly in those areas that are vulnerable to the coal transition. So we do think that crowding in CSI funding into that platform, it's not a fund, it's just a matter of matching what's available to what is needed, that we could really leverage a lot and not only spend one-on-one grants, but also look at matching grants to loans and to small business development. So I could go on, but I'm extremely positive. I actually think there's huge opportunity ahead of us, and I do think South Africa, once again, as we often do, is a trailblazer in this area, and I think all of us are very proud to be on this journey together. Thanks.
Absolutely. Now, Sitambile, I'm going to come back to you and a conversation that we actually had yesterday in terms of we know we've got so much going on in South Africa. The Just Energy Transition Plan is one of it, but part of one of our challenges, which is both a pro and a con, is packaging. Like Sue mentioned, there's a lot of countries looking to us to lead the way. We are trailblazing, particularly for the continent and a lot of other regions. But from a reputation management, from a nation brand perspective, how are you at Brand South Africa managing that?
Thank you. I think in line with our mandate, because we are storytellers of South African narrative and we influence that narrative, our collaboration is key in this regard because it goes beyond public sector and private sector. It actually is inclusive of citizens as well, because our job is also to educate citizens to be aware. We believe that citizens that are educated, they are citizens that are empowered. So our role precisely is to engage the citizens, the laymen on the street in South Africa, to understand what is this just transition plan mean to them, you know, so that they're able to take ownership but see themselves as part of the journey that will take South Africa forward. So we also do that bottom-up approach in how we engage communities and work with communities so that they are part of this successful trailblazing positioning story of South Africa. From a top down, ours is really to take the nuggets and the successes, achievements from business, from government, and amplify those, because a story that is not told, or rather is told to a niche audience, is really not doing justice to what South Africa stands for and who South Africa is. So our role then is to plug in and play a role of what we call it IMC, Integrated Marketing and Communications Experts, where we are able to showcase and profile public and private partnerships. And I think that's what has set South Africa apart. And we have become almost a benchmark country in how we have managed in the past, through collaborations, to come up with real world-class, remarkable solutions. So that is our role in a nutshell. I could go on and on in terms of what makes us great, but it can't be South Africans talking to South Africans. That is why you need Brand South Africa then to tell the world and give very strong reasons to believe. That is where we plug in, and we believe in the power of collaborations.
Well, I'm a PR and marketing person, so all of that makes such good sense to me. But as we know, a lot of what we do from a packaging perspective is storytelling. It's packaging our stories, sharing our story, and celebrating our stories. And yes, it starts with South Africans, and then it moves outward to the global community. So I'm going to send this one to either Shamila or Kulakani. In terms of your stories, could you share, if we had to unpack some of your success in terms of how far you've come with your partners, with your stakeholders, give us a story, one of your celebratory success stories in terms of how far you've already come in terms of the Just Energy transition plan. Choose one, your favorite one.
Put me on the spot first. It's time to think. I think the one that we outlined, that I did outline earlier, I think we mustn't underestimate the success of that, the Just Transition Pathways work that was done, because what that did is that it basically helped support the countries going to COP26 with enhanced ambition on our nationally determined contribution. So the fact that the work was done and what it pointed to, I think, was something also that government could reference and helped us go with enhanced NDCs. Going with those enhanced NDCs then actually caught the international community's eye and then landed us that 8.5 billion, which was the first JETP in the, effectively for any country, I think it was the first one, and that was COP26. And then COP27 on the back of that, and of course we have the JETPMU, and then there was an investment plan that came out. So, our success has been intertwined with what then was able the country to do, and it started going back there on that first one. And so we had COP26 enhanced NDCs, first 8.5 billion. COP27, we had the Just Investment Plan come out, which said, okay, this is what we need over kind of this 3-year period. So started giving shape and form to what we would need to do, and said we kind of do have a set of priorities that we want to look at investing in. And then we come to COP28, and we've got the implementation plan, which Sue has said has gotten so much support, and I think everybody actually sees that there's real opportunity that sits in there. And we also equally acknowledge that the just element of the transition is not going to be easy. So I see the success has been, firstly, just that we could have the scorecard that shows progress year to year. And secondly, that we, I think, collectively understand the challenge, and that we have a fact base that we can start working with as sectors already in terms of the Just Transition Pathways work that was done. That's open source information, and we know, for example, there are companies in the different sectors that are already using that as their transition blueprint for starting to reduce their emissions and what that might look like. So I see that as being a big success, but also because it was done with multiple stakeholder consultation. Business, government, civil society, number of actors in there, in those things, run as a process, every 6 weeks, feedback, update, CEO champions, part and parcel of that, engaged with that, and then coming out with those pathways that I think are quite unique. And I think that for me is a big success in the opportunity to, and jumping in and taking that opportunity for that. And I'm hoping that the work that we're doing now on the skills plan to try and get that private sector-led view on the skills, so that we can support this transition and at the same time take the opportunity for creating new age skills for our people and that helps create an economic, so it makes us more competitive economically going to the future. So I'd point to those two. And then the third one for for me is also going to be the capacitation of the state. So the NBI has a program called TAMDEV, Technical Assistance, Mentorship and Development. And what that really does is try to take private sector skills in quite a structured form and work with government on partnering to be able to do skills transfer and help with gaps where they exist, and ensure that we're working with our state for capacitation, because a capacitated state is in all of our interests. And so that, I think, has been really useful, that it could work both ways. You know, it can work for the state, it can be a useful conduit for private sector skills. I think I need an applause too. No, no. But those are some that I would point to. Thank you.
Something that you touched on, Sitembile touched on, something that we know, our youth or our younger South Africans are a very powerful group, particularly in our country. Powerful, energetic, they've got loud voices, huge opportunity and skills. It might be slightly left of center in terms of the specific conversation on collaboration between private sector and business sector in terms of the plan, but how are we incorporating that sector of our South African community? Because ultimately, we're building a South Africa for the future. They are the South Africa of the future. And I'll open this up to anyone in terms of how we're incorporating, how we're educating. You know, we know we've got multiple challenges. You know, we've got people that immediate goals is just putting food on the table, let alone whether I'm reducing my plastic consumptions or CO2 emissions for that day or week or month. But it is something that has to kind of work in parallel.
Let me make an initial attempt at answering your question. But before I do, just want to make a point that one of the less celebrated success, which I think is jointly owned by government and the private sector, is our renewable energy independent power producer program. It is a trailblazer in the world. It's one thing wherever you go, people ask you about it because they've read up about it and they say, this is amazing. Unfortunately, this is not celebrated as much in South Africa. It's a real tragedy because just by creating this program, we're able to get a response from the private sector that unlocked over 200 billion rand of investment in a period of 10 years. A minor change in the regulation, which removed the cap, has unlocked further investment in our renewable energy. Just in this year alone, investment in the order of something like 17 billion rand has been made because of how the private sector responds to the right regulation. When we try to do things in silos, we miss this opportunity because the chances are government is going to put up something that just isn't attractive to the private sector, and so we miss the opportunity. So I just want to underscore the importance of doing this collaboratively because we can achieve things that our peers in the world cannot achieve. Now, coming back to the question of the youth, I mean, this is a massive challenge. There is a program in the presidency that has, again, achieved quite a lot of success, started around COVID, but there are precursors to that program. One that originates from the private sector is the Harambee program, which is really looking at helping youth. It's a youth accelerator. Started, and I remember many, many years ago, around 2010, operating from a small little cramped office in Fox Street in Johannesburg with a target of just trying to assist 5,000 young people. When that was achieved, they started to think big and said, we can actually achieve more. And over the years, that program has achieved amazing things. It's now part of the National Pathway Management process in the presidency that's trying to help young people, given the scale of the youth unemployment challenge that we have in the country, to really become part of the economy in a meaningful way, all the way from placement in jobs, but also preparing young people, making sure that they're adequately skilled to be able to take up opportunities. So there is, again, it is another collaboration between the private sector and government that is bearing fruit because we are working together. Thank you.
I think I'm going to send that question to you again, Sitembile. From a nation's brand perspective, how are the youth and the younger generations being brought in to the different opportunities? Because like we know how amazing we are, and we know how fantastic we are as a country and what we have to offer and the strides we make and the stories that maybe aren't shared as much as they should be. But how do we incorporate them into that even more?
So as Brand South Africa, we created a movement which we coined Play Your Part, and deliberately so to make sure that there's an inclusive approach in how South Africa is positioned, marketed amongst South African citizens. So for us, youth is constantly, it's an always on, precisely because we understand that the majority of population is driven by youth. And we scale down to a point where we are able to trace the youth that is unemployed, despondent, and we are able to give them access to information. Because we are not the techno brains behind the actual plans. Ours is to take those platforms, the plans, and give exposure to the youth that is less communicated to. And that is where the gap is, where you find that they complain and they say, we do not get access to these opportunities. Where do we go? Because I'm not sure sometimes where these are advertised in terms of opportunities, but our job is to make sure that we package this information in a manner that is palatable, easy to understand to any youth in South Africa. And then we redirect traffic. So it's intentional. The Play Your Part is the South African way of doing things, because we had a vision to make sure that if people look at South Africa, they must look at this country that is able to turn things around, unprovoked, purely because they believe that they are South Africans and they believe in the country's future growth story. So to your point, in a very nutshell, ours is to bring the information to the people in the Bundus, in the urban areas. And if we believe if we don't do that, then who else will? And in doing so, we work with multiple media partners, some that are mass, that reach the mass audiences, and others that are very much, specific. Even going into varsities, for instance, where there are those student-wise channels, where we make sure that we have a voice. And it's deliberate, purely because we believe that the next person to carry South Africa is not people in this room talking about 2 decades. It's the people that are somewhere back in schools, and we have to empower them now. So through our Play Your Part program, we have been able to bring everybody along, because government says make sure that no one is left behind. So precisely we are doing that in our own way. Thanks.
Thank you so much. And I have to say, as someone that's lived intercontinental for the last 13 years between the Middle East and South Africa, there's so much pride when you look at the strides that are being made within the country, both from a tourism and industry and education perspective. And I think we lose sight of that as South Africans when you're in that environment of how incredibly progressive we are. I'm going to open up to a few questions before we go any further, just so that we don't run out of time for anyone that would like to ask our panel any questions.
Thank you. Good afternoon. My name is Unotle Mgadi. I am also from South Africa. It's a pleasure listening to both of the parties, and I've realized the growth of partnership between private and government. But perhaps at your level, you guys have figured it out. But if I take it to the local ground, it may be a different case, pointing out to maybe capacity building within the government in understanding how do you work with private sector, and also private sector, understanding how you work with government, because many times you will find that there's conflict within working within a space where government is operating, where they'll feel threatened that the private sector is coming to dominate and taking their job. And another thing, what is our common ground when we are doing these partnership? With the mindset, yes, we have the mindset that we want to take South Africa forward, but we can't run away of the clashes that are there when the two parties are trying to work together, because we have different mandates. So do we have a common ground that we understand if these two come together, how do we do it?
Sue, I'll maybe let you lead on that one.
Very important question. And I think it speaks to building the capacity of the state at every level to properly engage the private sector. And I agree with you that often it's very difficult for people working in government. They're not quite sure, how to engage, and especially because we're so strictly governed by procurement rules. We need to protect against corruption. We've got all of these really important obligations to protect the integrity of the way in which government works. And I do think that I go back to this point about building the capacity of the state, because we have mechanisms for public-private partnerships. We understand what the PFMA says, the MFMA says. We understand what the legal framework is. We know what the regulatory procedures are. But what we found is that we don't always have the capacity in our departments, in provinces, in municipalities, to really decide what role we want the private sector to play in a particular service delivery. So let's say in a municipality we've got a wastewater treatment problem. And furthermore, our infrastructure hasn't been maintained over a period of time. We don't have the capital to reinvest. We've run out of engineers to do the work. We really have a crisis, and our people are suffering because the system doesn't work, keeps breaking down. So what we really have to do then is, as the government officials responsible for that service delivery, we have to do an optioneering exercise. We have to say, what options do we have to fix this problem within the resources that we have? And that takes a systematic analysis of all of the options, the financial options, the technical options, the legal options. And that work can't be done with the private sector or with anybody else. Government officials have to sit down and really weigh up those options. And then from there, having weighed up the options, do an analysis of which is the best option to pursue. And if the best option is a partnership option with the private sector, then there's a feasibility study that has to be done. And all of these steps require skills and expertise and experience often in how to actually take those steps towards a procurement event, because ultimately it is a procurement event. You're actually going out and asking the private sector to do certain roles under the authority of a contract with the municipality. And that contract has to be procured in a way that is consistent with the law and with the Constitution, and it has to be done really well. So we have huge capacity problems in all right across the state, and I don't want to point to any one area, because there's capacity problems for that project prep everywhere. So what an organization like NBI and others do is that they will say, we can come in with retired expertise, right, through the TAMDEV program. And we can come in and work with the municipal officials, not on behalf of a private company that's going to bid for the ultimate contract, but just because we've set aside resources ring-fenced in the NBI to build capacity and assist. Now, there are other avenues for assistance, so we can look at partnerships with the private institutions that have set up to help build capacity in the state. And their mandate is to build capacity in the state, not to do the job of the state for it, or to even do the job of the private sector in investing, but also come in with capacity building. So I think we need to make best use of those facilities that are available, and they've been very successful. We've had retired engineers being placed in municipalities to help the officials through some of these technical issues. We've had lawyers, retired lawyers being placed to help with work, project prep people. So that's an avenue that can be explored. And I think it's a safe one, and it's a well established mechanism. And we just, I think we've got to systematically, honestly identify where we have difficulties in preparing this work, and then we've got to look for where we can get help. There's also, through the Just Energy Transition, we're looking at the grant mechanisms that are available through the partners groups. And as I said, we've got around 700 million that's come in as grant facilities to the Just Energy Transition, and quite a lot of that is going into capacity building and technical assistance to municipalities. There are about 60 municipalities that are being assisted at the moment through the JET program with grants in that regard. So I think we've just got to work together on what is going to be the best way of dealing with this. But what we do have to recognize is that actually there are distinct roles. So if a private party is coming in as an investor, they can't also be the preparer of the project. That would be crossing the line, right? So we must look for facilities that can support capacity building and then design the right call for proposals to get the private investor in. It's a long journey, and I don't think there's simple answers, but you've raised such an important question, and it's one that we have to tackle together. Okay, I don't know if that helps, but I'm sure other people have got experience.
Would anyone else like to contribute to that one? Yeah.
Firstly, let me just say that, I mean, this is a fantastic question to which there are no easy answers. I'm going to assume that you don't have a PhD. I'm going to say that that should be your PhD topic, because you can come back and solve the problem for all of us. And I spent 10 years in government in the presidency, so I have been on both sides and have seen this at play. I mean, I think that a dose of humility on both sides of the fence is absolutely important. Sometimes we come from the private sector and we think we know it all, and technically we probably do, but there are just certain things we do not know about how government works, and we get tripped by very, very small things, right? Similarly, if government just tries to do everything on its own, it very often gets it wrong. They will put up an RFP, request for proposal, that nobody will respond to because it makes no commercial sense, right? So just a dose of humility to make sure that we get things right with the appropriate guardrails to make sure that you don't cross the lines, etc., etc. We are a country that has enormous resources from a skills point of view. And yet sometimes we fail at the basic things as if we don't. So I'm going to digress a bit and say, we have failing hospitals on the one hand, completely. And we have other hospitals that are globally acclaimed. They're doing business here and the rest of the Middle East because the model works. Why can't we learn from each other, right? So sometimes this rigid line between the private and the private robs us of the opportunity to learn from each other. These are, by the way, skills developed in the same country, using the same public funds, because universities are publicly funded institutions. We're happy to see those skills go and benefit people in Canada and not people in Soweto. That's a tragedy. And this is because we don't solve this problem of how the private sector and government can work together in a way that benefits society. We're hung up on kind of old ideologies of private is bad, private sector is after profits, etc., etc. And of course, people are in business to make money, but you can put the right guardrails, as I say, so that there are no obscene profits, no exploitation, etc. But you still make sure that the skills, the know-how benefits South Africans. I can go on about how people trained in South Africa are doing amazing things elsewhere in the world that we're struggling with, and that's just not on.
Thank you. Are there any other questions? Yes, right in the front.
Thank you. I guess it's not so much of a question, it's more of a perspective that I wanted to share. So I'm an affordable housing consultant. I work at the New York State Energy Research and Development Authority. I also work with some large affordable housing developers in South Africa. You know, my background's really mainly built environment. And one thing I just wanted to point out is how a lot of these, you know, there was reference to the REPP and how that has been a success, but I think a lot of private sector companies have moved in and taken advantage of these opportunities. And we've seen that a lot of the disadvantaged communities haven't really been at the forefront of maybe benefiting from those solutions. One of the things that we did see, what I have seen in the state of New York, for example, is where the state actually takes a percentage, what they call a system benefits charge. They take a percentage of revenues from the private utilities, and that revenue is what really goes to driving an R&D machine, research and development that is focused on driving the energy transition with a focus on disadvantaged communities. So, we look at South Africa, where you look at companies like Discovery, they're pretty much also now getting into renewables, and they are, it's going to a disadvantage, obviously, the municipality, the city of Johannesburg, which, traditionally has had that role of providing electricity. So how about we look at, yes, private sector is running ahead, and, they are taking advantage of a lot of these subsidies and are setting up plants, but let's look at ways we can also tax or take a percentage of those profits that private sector is going to derive as a result of this enabling environment that has been created, and then use that funding to redirect into programs that can go into this disadvantaged communities, can drive youth entrepreneurship, can drive technology adoption. This is where I'm not really seeing South Africa coming up with robust ideas about how we collaborate with private sector. Thank you.
I think that's quite an interesting concept, perhaps to explore. Sue, did you have anything on that?
Yes, I mean, you're absolutely right. I think that we need to start exploring these options, and we need to look at them on a sector-by-sector basis to really identify where we could be targeting R&D particularly. I think we, as a country, our investment in R&D is very low, actually. And it's something that we absolutely have to address. I think it's especially in this sort of low economic growth period, funds are just not going in that direction. So it is a structure that has worked in many jurisdictions. I guess we'd have to look at where those funds go to and how they are managed and how they're dispersed. And I guess that's something that needs quite a lot of careful attention to make sure that it goes where it needs to go. And also that I suppose kind of a royalty that comes off the profit margin of the utility provider. It does not act as a disincentive for investment. So we'd have to be very careful to structure it correctly for the particular sector. I know that the REAP program probably is going to go through some adaptation as we move forward. It was designed very much as a reverse auction mechanism with a strong sovereign guarantee, and therefore it really stimulated the early investments. I think the fiscus is now in a position where they're wanting to say, do we really need these sovereign guarantees? Is there not enough confirmed revenue flow and security on the income side not to have to burden the fiscus going forward? And I know that there has been a lot of discussion around whether the benefits to the communities are really achieving what they were intended to achieve. So there has been quite a lot of analysis on that. And I do think that in the next round of the REAPs, there might well be some adjustments in that regard. So thank you very much for the contribution. I think it's very valuable.
Thank you very much. I'm going to come back to the panel just for some closing remarks. In terms of the future, moving forward, we've talked about interesting plans, exciting ideas, campaigns and initiatives in place. Is there anything in terms of looking forward that you'd like to add before I'll hand over to Sithimbile to close?
I think from our side, as I said, we are just the storyteller. We'll lean so much closer to government, we'll lean very close to business and their initiatives. Because to me, the future looks at a South Africa that is able to participate and contribute in global issues, right? If you look at the World Economic Report, the risk report, we know environmental issues, they are key, they are there as a risk. Energy security is there as a risk. And we are talking about a South Africa that is a trailblazer. So I look forward to a positioning job that will shift the orthodox thinking around South Africa as a brand that is sort of limited to the manufacturing, the agro, the mining, even the creative arts, because it's very easy to promote South Africa when we have talented people around the creative arts space. But I see a South Africa that is going to lead with remarkable solutions and groundbreaking projects in as far as science and tech is concerned, in innovation, in ensuring that we are there when we talk of just energy transition, and we are not just a small Anyana country, but we are bold and we are brave about it. So as an entity that is able to give that narrative and shift those perceptions, that is what I look forward to.
Shamila Kulakani, anything before we close for the afternoon?
I think we just, continue to work together. And, the point was made earlier on, there's a level of humility all around that needs to accompany that, because it's not an easy space. And we know we're off a difficult base, and what we're trying to do now is in some ways undoing, quite a complicated past. And so the need to work with humility and understand that it can be possible, celebrate those successes, thank you Brand SA, is going to be important. And that it really has to be, we're facing a little bit of uncharted territory. We have to do it together. We don't have the answers, not anyone. And let's always do that with the preservation of the greater good of all our citizens at heart. And if I had one wish, it would be, I would want a metric for reducing unemployment, something akin to a net zero for unemployment. That would be my wish.
Say is that, it's well and good to have the plan and the sort of stated ambitions of where we want to be, etc. But to be able to get there, there's a lot of work that needs to be done at a granular level. What is necessary to decarbonize the transport sector? What regulations have to change to make sure that we see the transition taking place, and then we take decisions, timely decisions, in each of the areas. And the work done by NBI and BUSA, assisted by PCG, does go into a sectoral analysis of what needs to be done. Now we need to make sure that we really go through each of these areas and say, if skills is an important part of this, is the regime appropriate, right? What do we need to tweak to make sure that this happens? So I think that is what we need to do, and we are absolutely committed to working with government in addressing this. We have a private sector that is very, very committed to the country, that is very patriotic. Let's work together. We can solve this. Thanks.
Thank you. Yes, absolutely.
I think that what we're very excited about is that the Just Energy Transition Implementation Plan has set up an architecture of focus. So there's 6 portfolios. We know who the main stakeholders are that need to drive each portfolio. We're bringing them together in councils, forums, and structures to co-create the solutions for that sector. So if it's electric vehicles or green hydrogen or transmission investment or skills, municipal distribution systems, we're going to bring the best brains that we have in the country together to say, how do we take this forward? And it means identifying the legal and regulatory problems, identifying the capacity problems, financing issues that need to be solved. And what we are seeing is a huge amount of creativity on how we get through this. I mean, just on the financing in the last year, we had the pledges from the International Partners Group. In many ways, the concessional funding that is offered on the table is business as usual for concessional finance to the country. But now we're seeing it's not so straightforward. We need to be clever about how we allocate these instruments. And both ourselves and the specialists in these sectors and the financiers are beginning to say we need to think differently, we need to find different creative solutions. And I really do think there's a new energy around finding a way forward, because we now have a structure and a focus. So yeah, I'm positive. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Thank you to our wonderful panelists, Sue, Sitembile, Shamila, and Kulekani. I think there's a big couple C's that came out of this conversation, which are exciting: creativity, celebration, collaboration, and I think, if nothing else, those are sort of some key terminology for us to hold on to for today. Well, thank you to everyone for joining us. Enjoy the rest of your Friday and our wonderful Dubai winter that we have prepared for you outside. Have a wonderful weekend and the rest of COP28. Yeah, thanks for being here. Thanks for sharing your afternoon with us.